Sara De Bondt has created a unique role for herself, weaving together an adventurous design practice with a crucial publishing venture. In doing so, she manages to straddle both the past and the future in her work, making her the epitome of a cultural designer, combining a love of contemporary typography with a deep investigation into the history of graphic design. Her practice consists of client-based work, designing and editing books, curating conferences, and her playful aesthetic is always idea-based, typography-driven, and born of a deep collaboration with her clients. Some of her clients include the Wiels Centre for Contemporary Art, Nottingham Contemporary, as well as the V&A, the Barbican, London's Institute of Contemporary Arts, Camden Arts Center, MIT Press, the Tate, pretty much every cultural institution in London, it seems like. When she's not working on client-based projects, she is running Occasional Papers, which she co-founded in 2008, which is a nonprofit publishing house investigating the histories of architecture, art, design, film, and literature. In 2009, she curated the conference The Form of the Book, which explored the world of book design. She received her MFA from Sint-Lukas, Brussels, and completed postgraduate research at the Jan van Eyck Academie. And prior to opening her own studio in 2004, she worked with a previous Insight speaker, Daniel Eatock, at Foundation 33 in London. She also teaches design at the Royal College of Art, Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design, and KASK School of Art. So I am very excited to welcome Sara De Bondt.
Hello, good evening. Thank you to AIGA and Walker Art Center for inviting me and bringing me over. And thank you to Emmett Byrne and to Cole Dillon for organizing the trip. It's a real honor to be here. I've followed the series for a long time, and I think it's an amazing thing that you guys are running, so thank you. This is a kind of silly picture that I just put there to remind myself to tell you a little bit about me before I dip into the talk. I think Emmett's kind of gone through most of it. Maybe the only thing to add is that I'm from Belgium, and this is a picture of the Princess of Belgium wearing a handbag in the shape of Belgium. It's a tiny country in the middle of Europe, and since the last 10 years I've been living in the UK and running my design studio there. And it's not just me at the moment, there's also Mark El-Khatib, who's a full-time graphic designer, and Katie Morrell, who's our studio manager. And then we have Luke Gould, who's 2 days a week freelancing with us, and intern Emma Kalkova. I think it's important to say that it's not just me. This is a poster for another talk, and as I was preparing, I've been quite used to giving a specific kind of talk, which just goes through 3 projects in depth, and I got a bit sick of it, so I thought I should try and reformat it a little bit. And then Emmett actually said to me, oh, you should just show really beautiful images. And I thought, okay, maybe rather than talking about the process too much, I should just show more work and then try and find a thread that runs through the work. And when I looked at that poster, which I didn't design, it was designed by the students in Darmstadt in Germany, it made me think that it's supposed to be a split in 2 between Occasional Papers and my own practice, but I realized that actually that's something that maybe runs through pretty much most of the things that we do, which is this idea of deconstructing things. And but with Occasional Papers, we published this book quite recently, which is an anthology of writing on graphic design historiography, and one of the texts in there is by Ellen Lupton and J. Abbott Miller about deconstruction in graphic design. And what I'm talking about is maybe not so much what they're talking about, which is maybe more about visual deconstruction. What I want to talk about more is how in my work I try to deconstruct the parameters of a brief or the things that build up a project. So I'll show you a series of things we've made, organized in 3 categories: identities, exhibition design, and books, and try and talk about in each job how and what has been deconstructed. So the first one is Wiels. This is kind of in chronological order. Wiels is a contemporary art center in Belgium, and they're based in this brewery, which was built in the 1930s, and designed by Adrian Blomme. And the building was derelict for a long, long time. And so when Wiels was founded and were going to go into this building, they were very nervous about the strong visual aspect of the building, and they were frightened that their art would be kind of too dominated by this amazing building. So they did a competition for an identity, and in the brief was clearly written that they didn't want a nostalgic-looking identity. And this is the logo of the beer that used to be brewed in the building. It was a brewery. So these are some elements that were kind of influencing the design process. And while I was working on it, I was reading this book by Bob Gill, and in it he says that good graphic design is something you can explain to someone over the telephone. It's something that's maybe not based on form, but also that's got a strong idea. And that's something that at the time I was quite obsessed about wanting to do something that's maybe not only for people that know about it or that can get it, but to try and do something that you can just say to somebody who doesn't have a clue about design or contemporary art. And these were some initial sketches that we did, trying to how do you translate the idea of contemporary art in a logo? Because the client really didn't want to make any reference to the building. So it's like from references from the Bauhaus to the one in the middle is Marcel Brotaars, who is an artist, a very well-known Belgian conceptual artist who used these plaques to maybe thinking about how art is written, how you have very strong conventions for the caption next to an artwork, which is always like with the title in italic and the rest in regular, those kind of things. But then quite soon we realized that actually one of the letters of the logo is already in the building. So that's then the logo that we ended up presenting. And it was a kind of struggle with the client to come to a decision of a color. And as I lived in London and the building was in concrete, I thought maybe yellow is a good option because the people who designed the roads system in England must have thought about it for a long time and done a lot of visual tests. And when the identity was launched in the press, they wrote that they thought that maybe the color yellow was because of the beer that used to be brewed in the brewery. So that was. I also started working together with Jode Baardemaker, who's an amazing type designer, and we developed this typeface, which comes from the idea that the E has 4 stripes in it. So the dimensions of the letters have to be a little bit different so it doesn't clog up when you print it very small. And the other reference is Belgian road signs, because we wanted to make something that felt like it was almost not designed, or like you wouldn't even notice that it was over-designed or something like that. And so there's a whole story behind how the identity was developed, and you can read about it in this little pamphlet that they made, which you can order from the Wiels website, and it kind of explains all of this. And so why I'm showing this and what it's got to do with deconstruction is that maybe this is the one project we've been doing that's the most kind of graphic design project, because it's an identity that we've been developing since 2007 when they opened. And I think slowly, bit by bit, we've kind of started deconstructing our own rules in a way. So this is when they opened. This was the opening campaign. And everything we do for Wiels has to be in 3 languages. So that in itself is quite a task. And some of the initial designs included things like this, a lot of pattern-based things. We also made an animation together with Mark Owens for the opening campaign. And then when we got to the signage, we went back to Marcel Brotaars and his molded plastic signs and the street signs in Belgium, and made all the signage. Found the original printer that did those for the artist, and use that technique to do all the funder names, for example. But I think the signage is what then sort of started to influence this idea of deconstructing the identity. And this is some examples of that. And this is the first one, where we are slowly trying to create new versions of the typeface. So it's the first time we added a light and a stencil version or an outline version. And since then, every time we do something, we try to kind of develop it or break it down in a way. This is the annual brochure. And this is even trying to deconstruct the logo itself. Emmett was telling me that you do a similar thing here with the shop, which is kind of funny. So Wiels was like a really big thing to get, and it still is. They're a really amazing client. And because of that job, we then got another one in Nottingham. And it's called Nottingham Contemporary. And it was a brand new building designed by Caruso St. John Architects. And at the time, I was really freaked out because I was like, everybody likes Wiels. There's no way we're going to be able to do something similar. So I thought, how can you... And also, I wanted to go away from doing something so logo-centric or logo-focused. So we came up with the idea that maybe the logo should become an exhibition space, so you don't have a logo. So we invited all these artists to make logos for us. And it's supposed to be an ongoing, open invitation to the artists that they work with. And the artist always gets credited as well. That kind of caused a lot of problems, obviously, because some of them are really hard to use. Like there's one that's a person whose head is cut off. And so the Nottingham Contemporary was quite anxious about creating something else that would make it clear that it's them. So they were very keen for a really strong typeface to go on the side to kind of, give them a recognizable voice. So we did some research in St. Bride Library in London, which is a really amazing resource if you're ever in London of typographic literature, and found these printing examples of the University of Nottingham, which included this typeface that we then digitized. Again, together with Jo de Baardemaker. And then the signage itself, because I don't know if you remember the building, it's got all these like slats. So we proposed that the signage would be these bus signs of rotating signs to kind of make the building come alive. So that's what that became. And then the architects loved the artist logo so much that they also integrated them into the building and even made them into like huge signs. This is by Mark Gubb. So after doing that one, it's like, how can you, what can you do next when you do an identity? Okay, maybe you can open up the logo, but what are the other elements that make up an identity? There's a color palette, there's a typeface, and probably, the logo. So how could you do an identity that doesn't have any of those things? And Milton Keynes Gallery is based in Milton Keynes, which is a new city in the UK. They started building it in the 60s with the idea of taking the pressure off London. It was like a commuter city. And it's got a very strong grid. And it's also the home for some of the decoders of during the Second World War. So it's got quite a strong kind of connection to grids and to structure. So we proposed to the client not to have any typeface, but just for them to use a set of system fonts, including Arial, which I've always been told never to ever use because it's like the wrong thing to do, but I kind of liked doing that. So the only thing that they were allowed to do, had to do, was to glue the M and the K together, which you can easily do on Word. So you don't need any designer to make this identity. And instead of a color, that the color should always come from the art that it's sitting next to. And so if you don't have a fixed typeface and you don't have a fixed logo and you don't have a fixed color palette, what is it that you can fix to make an identity? And so we came up with this grid system that's kind of based on the grid system of Milton Keynes. So it's always based on the square, and whenever they show anything, it's got to use this kind of grid. This is the website. So different ways of how they use, our client uses the identity. Or some business cards. So it's kind of always hanging of the same line. And as soon as the line is full, it pushes to the next one, depending on the sizes of the boxes. And we also did some super graphics on the building. So the logo is different on each facade. It's just got the grid. And this is how it was applied. It was with a local sign painter who spent 2 weeks just painting it directly onto the building. So after that, we were commissioned by Interior, which is a really amazing design fair in Belgium that's been going since 1968. And every 2 years, they hold like a huge fair showing new design. And the first commission that we were given by them was to design their book, celebrating their, I think, what was it, 40 years? And every 4 years, every 10 years, they change the size of their catalog. So instead of doing a book in one size, we made it into the 4 different sizes over the 40 years. And while we were doing that, I found out about Boudewijn de Lare, who was the Belgian designer who designed most of their posters from the beginning up until the last 3 are not his, but all the others are by him. And I was really inspired by that and went to meet him to look at his work. And when we finished the book, we were commissioned to do the identity of the fair as well, and given the brief that we can do whatever we want, but we have to use Boudewijn's logo, which was this one. And Boudewijn, he had drawn it himself by hand in the 60s, so we thought, okay, maybe another way of not doing an identity is not to throw away what's come before you, but to try and build on it and expand it and maybe do like a homage to another designer. So we tried to make it into a typeface and did lots of versions. And kind of gave that to the fair, so they are still using it now. And if you go back to the book, you see what's really nice about all these posters is they're really flat graphics. He never used any photography, apart from the last 3 who are not his. And so I thought maybe one thing to push what he does further would be to use something pixel-based, like photographic. And we managed to convince the client to do a photo shoot with furniture, because that's what the fair is about. And we worked with Tim Good, who is a Dutch photographer, and had this crazy day of shooting these plastic chairs, because we thought if it's a fair about design, you don't want to showcase one particular designer, but we want to show a beautiful object that everybody knows it's very well designed, but nobody knows who the designer is, because otherwise it's all competition about the manufacturers at the fair and those kinds of things. And unfortunately, when we showed it to the client, they totally freaked out, and they said that it looked like a garden furniture fair that it was going to be. So this was already quite late in the process, so we decided to just kind of take the blurring, the pixel-based idea a little bit further, and maybe develop an identity that's based on color. So everything that we did just simply had the typeface we made, and then try to experiment with the use of color as much as possible. So they always change. And for example, this is the invitation card, which was a really long fold-out card, and we use this technique called split tuck printing. I think they use it in the US also a lot. It's where you have one roll of printing, you just put lots of different colors in it, and as you print, the ink mixes in different ways. So this was all the fluorescent colors together in one invitation card. And so you get, every card is a different color. And this one as well was a mix of gold and silver, so you don't know until it's printing what the effect will be. And at the end, the last ones just look like a horrible brown mush. Then we also did some notebooks for them. So every notebook was different. And then we did the signage for the fair. And we made this gigantic color walkway. So you would park your car close to a color, and then you'd remember which color entrance you were at. So, for example, close to red. And then we put colored vinyl on the entrances, and the map as well was color coded, so you'd know how to navigate the building, because it's a really massive fair. And for the signage inside, we thought it'd be really nice to make a three-dimensional color, so to make objects that have one color going into another in a three-dimensional thing, but that turned out to be too difficult to do because we only had one day to install all these signs, and these objects would need 3 points of hanging, and that, you know, they needed to pay for every time they would hang a board, so we just made a flat one. And then also did these pencils with rainbow colors in them. I think this is the last one in the identities, and it's an art fair in Turin in Italy, Artissima, and we did that in 2011. And when we started the job, there were 2 really well-known art fairs in the UK. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but Frieze Art Fair in London. Everybody in the art world knows it. There's now one in New York as well, I think. And their identity was designed by Graphic Thought Facility, and they always use really beautiful imagery of the park where the fair is held. And the other really well-known one was Basel Art Fair. I think there's Basel Miami now as well, designed by Muller and Hess, and that's very strong typography. So we thought, okay, we have to do a fair. It's maybe a less well-known fair, but still, how can we do an identity that's strong and that's not typography or a photograph? How can we generate an image that's neither of these 2 things? So we came up with this idea to start the Office for Statistics, and that every piece of print and everything we did would have some kind of statistic on it, so that the identity becomes a way of generating content. For example, this is the letterhead, which tells you everything about the mail that Artissima sends out. Or the press invite, which tells you the galleries and the artists at the fair on the left, and when they were founded, so you can immediately see roughly from which time the artists were born that take part in the fair. Or on the right is a different type of press coverage they had, and you see that most press coverage was web and online. And we also numbered each statistic, and then they were available online. And when they had a new director, she told us that she had looked at the statistics before applying to her job, which I thought was really amazing. That graphic design can actually be the generator of content, that you don't just have to make someone else's content look pretty, but that you can be the one saying, I want to generate this information and make it public. This is an example of an ad which showed all the nationalities of the fairs of the galleries taking part in the fair over the years. So in the top left is the beginning, and the bottom is the most recent one. And you can see that the more recent ones have a lot more different nationalities taking part, and that the UK has got a lot more galleries compared to the beginning, where it was really mostly Italian galleries. I think that was quite useful information for the fair itself to see as well, to realize. This is the same rendering of the same information on the left, and on the right is more like an abstract rendering of the galleries and what section they were in. This one was used on the poster, and it's the cities that galleries are from, and then it's, if you like, the distance to Turin that they had to travel. So the longest is in the middle, that's from the States. And then the thickness is the amount of galleries from that city. So you'll immediately see that there are loads of galleries coming from Berlin and a lot from London and a lot from Milan. And what was really nice was people started to follow these things. So we did a few ads in Art Press, and people would comment on the kind of information generated. And we also did it for the catalog. And this is the cover showing the content of the catalog. So you see the gray area are the adverts, and the red is the information about the cultural program. And we generated statistics about the content of the book as well. And this is the one that I found the most amazing, is the gender of the artist who won the prize of Artissima, the Illy Prize. There was one year where women were doing really well, and then it was economic downturn. And, and this is the language used in one of the essays, and where you see, for example, that the word museum, project, and model are really high up compared to the word artist. And we also did the signage of the fair. This is the outside facade, and we did a gigantic graph which compares the visitors, the curators, and the galleries. But what's really the most fun to do was our booth at the fair, because that's the one thing why we kind of started the whole project, which everybody wants to know is the financial aspect of art selling. And the design of our booth was together with an Italian artist, and there are also graphs. So 100% would be the top of the booth and 0 the bottom. And for example, the pink one, the first one in the pink one is the percentage of female curators. The biggest one is female staff in the administration, and the lowest is female artists represented. And we also had these blackboards painted inside the booth, and every day we would go and go find statistics and then paint them and then wipe them off and do it again the next day. And so the first day we went around the fair and just counted all the artworks, quite basically, that were on display. And one of the last days we went and asked everybody for their most expensive artwork and the cheapest. So the most expensive was 600,000 euros and the cheapest 65. But also, it's us who are doing all these statistics, so you have to kind of not take it totally serious, because apparently they told the director of the fair different prices, and it's kind of more of a rough idea. This is, on the left, the amount of artworks per stall. So most stalls had between 6 and 10 artworks. And the right is really interesting, is the staff involved in the fair. So most of it was security. This is the very last one in identities. And it's a really small job that I did a long time ago, but I kind of found it again this week. It's for a gallery in London. And it's this deconstruction in the sense that it's about humor, that it's they were wanting to play with the big guys, and instead we made this letterhead that never folds down straight. So it's free-folded. And the business card, you can never read it, you have to always turn it around. And now I'll talk quickly about some exhibition design we did. This was at the Barbican Gallery in London. And they did this exhibition called the Martian Museum of Terrestrial Art. And the idea of the curators was that they would pretend Martians had landed on Earth and found all this art and try and understand it and explain it to each other. So it was a pitch in 2008. And rather than show finished designs, we showed mostly research. And one of the things was, okay, if we're going to do an exhibition about aliens, we should find out what exists in our popular culture about typography from non-human life. For example, Klingon, or this is how we communicate with gorillas or even things that are made up or whatever. And we found out that the most likely way we'd be able to communicate with aliens would be through mathematics. And the curators were quite keen for the display not to be a kind of traditional contemporary art display, meaning that you have a really big white space with one object carefully presented, but instead they wanted to do a kind of science museum type display, which means much more packed in and with more illustrations and much more explanation. So we went to look at examples from that. And the other aspect that involved our design work was the style guide of the Barbican, which was designed by North. So they had very strict rules about what we were allowed to do and not allowed to do, including the logo, which was this, and so that we turned into a picture of Mars. And then we decided, okay, if it's a show by Martians, we should do everything in bilingual, in English and in Martian. So we came up with Futura ET. Futura is this typeface from the Barbican, and we made a geometrical typeface with it based on mathematics. And the other rule from the Barbican was that everything coming out of the gallery had to be in a bold italic and rotated at 9 degrees. I don't know, it was quite hard to design with those parameters, but we did it. So this says Martian Museum in bold italic at 9 degrees. And then we did a glow-in-the-dark invite. And we worked together with Jamie Fobert Architects to do the exhibition design. And they had this idea that maybe the exhibition could be like a gigantic green pod that had landed on Earth, and from the pod would come all these wires to the different categories in the show, and then those would go to the artworks. So that's what this is. There were quite strong categories that the curators had thought about of how to group the artworks. So kinship and descent, magic and belief, communication and ritual. And then from those would then leave and go to the wall texts. And the materials that we used was supposed to reference like a computer chip. So it's all perspex and colors from computer chips and copper. So the captions were printed copper. And this is the audio guide, which was a Martian talking to you. But I think what was the most amazing thing, which was that picture I showed you earlier on about us going to the Science Museum, was this, that one of the works got pulled at the last minute. The artist didn't want to be in the show, and the curators decided to make a caption for it anyway, and then put up this piece of paper saying it was removed. And I think what was nice about it was that how maybe our research could influence the making of the exhibition in a way. And the best thing was that the curators learned to write Martian. If you can. And we also did one panel completely in Martian. And then we started thinking about the catalog and looked at things like this, which is you get in nature books, history books, of these kind of illustrations that I was showing earlier on as well, of explaining how objects were used. So we thought probably Martians will try and do something like that. So we worked with an illustrator to make illustrations like that. And we also thought, again, like if the exhibition wasn't supposed to be a typical contemporary art exhibition, the catalog also should be more like an encyclopedia that feels more appropriate to that kind of display. And so this was the catalog. So it became the Encyclopedia of Terrestrial Life, Volume 8 Art. And we also invented these other categories of the encyclopedia, which don't exist, but sometimes the museum gets phone calls of people asking, can I order volume 9, philately? And this is how the illustrations were used. And there was also an essay from a Martian writing home to the Alien Affairs Committee on Mars, saying how he had infiltrated in the London art world and ended up with the coke habit. And we also cut out all the artworks, because often when you get imagery for an art catalog, you'll see the wall behind it, or you'll see the exhibition. So we cut them all out to make them feel more scientific and group them together. Then we did another exhibition at the Barbican Art Gallery in London, which was with the same curator, Francesco Manacorda. And he came up with this exhibition in 2009 of artists working with nature or the environment. And it was again a pitch. And when we were invited to do a pitch, I tried to make some work that's useful even if you don't win the pitch. So in this case in particular, it was extremely useful to take it as a starting point to think about how can we do the same thing as graphic designers? How can we think about our impact on the environment? And things like this in my studio made me think about it as very much. For example, the packaging on the left is supposed to be ecological packaging, but it's full color printed cardboard. And the same as the kind of green design book, which is a picture of cardboard or recycled paper, and it's printed in full color. Or the one at the top, it's a design competition, and arrived in 2 copies in a plastic bag like that. So I thought, okay, it's good to be offended, but it's also good to try and maybe at least find out a little bit what you can do. So I thought I'd quickly share that with you. We found this, widgets are not really in fashion anymore, but it's still available. If you go to Apple, they have for free a sustainable graphic design widget, and it tells you a lot of things, including which inks are better than others. Fluorescent ink is quite bad. Metallic inks as well. We've found this typeface which saves on inkjet ink because it's got small dots in it. So if you print it small, you don't see that it's got holes in it, but you save a lot of inkjet. We found a lot of things like that. And in the end, we only ended up presenting this to the Barbican, which was a simple report saying how they could improve their footprint, their ecological footprint. And also made a manifesto that if we were going to do the design of the exhibition, we would follow these rules. For example, spot varnish means you cannot recycle paper. Same for foil blocking. It's better not to print a full sheet, an image full bleed, try and put it smaller. We wanted to do no vinyl lettering because it cannot be recycled. Not to use any glue, only to use nails. Uncoated paper is easier to recycle than coated paper. Wire binding is better than glue binding. CMYK is worse than black and white, all these kind of things. We also did some tests with printing with beetroot juice or coffee, or we thought maybe we can do some growing type. And we tried to convince the curators of making people cycle when they watched the video, but they didn't go for that. I think the best idea we had, this was the show that was on at the time while we were working on it, and we proposed to recycle the exhibition into the furniture. And we had this is a really amazing book that you should get if you're looking for furniture in your home. It's called Autoprogettazione by Enzo Mari. And it's a book that he made with the intention of allowing people, anybody, to make their own furniture without needing any power tools. So all you need is a nail and a hammer. And there are these beautiful designs. And the philosophy behind the book is if you can show people how to make great designs themselves, they'll have more respect for design. So we used his designs to make the furniture for the exhibition. And yeah, it was quite surprising how something that maybe you always try and do the newest or the most funky or the latest thing, and maybe reusing something can actually add value as well. And this was the title wall, so we took just pieces of white wall that we could find and then routed into them this text. So we just removed material, we didn't add anything, and they were all drilled into the wall, so no glue, so the nails could just be removed and used again. And then for the posters as well, For the exhibition graphics, these were old Barbican posters, and we just turned them around and printed on the back just in one color, so we didn't use any vinyl and just used nails. And for the catalog too, we made this little manifesto of only using recycled paper, no full bleed images, no foil blocking. And we used it, we kind of stole the idea from the Eco font and made our own pattern versions. It was quite a struggle with the curators to try and keep the images small, which is fair enough. They wanted it to be visible. But yeah, we got there. And what was really fun was then we came to doing the exhibition guide, and the Barbican told us, gave us a budget of £2,000 and said they needed 30,000 copies. And we said, how do you know you need 30,000 copies? And they said, we don't, it's an estimate. So we were able to convince them, rather than spending that money on printing, to buy us a Riso printer. And so we printed them on demand and just went there when they ran out. And in the end, we only printed 15,000 copies, and we're still using the paper. And this is from 2009. Yeah. At this point, I had just started together with Anthony Houdek occasional papers, and the Barbican had seen these samples of printing with beetroot juice and all that kind of thing, and invited us to do a workshop for their family weekends. And at first I thought it's a great idea, but then I realized actually it's just doing the opposite. It's adding more useless things that nobody needs, using materials just for entertainment. And so Anthony came up with this idea of doing Barterama, which was a printed matter swap fair. So they have a really nice conservatory. And we invited all our friends to have a stall with their designs, or anybody who had old books to come over and just trade printed matter. This is the last exhibition that I want to talk about. And it's an exhibition of my own work that was curated by Anthony Houdek, who is my partner, in 2011 in Le Havre in France. And it's always difficult, I think, to exhibit graphic design. And we talked about it a lot with Anthony, and we came up with this system that it was a super small gallery space in a school. And when you came in, there was one big space, and then on the side, two smaller ones. And we thought maybe rather than just showing work behind glass or whatever, maybe it's nice to make new work that shows how much I use systems. So we divided the space in 3 different categories. So the main space was exhibition space, and then there was one museum space and one archive space. And in the museum space, we made things like this, which is, we basically made a list of all the projects that I'd ever done and the systems that we used in them, and then randomly picked 3 things to go together, which would make a new work. For example, this is the system of the color gradients from interior, and the system of rotating things at 9 degrees from another project, and using graffiti from a third one. This is another one, which is the signage shapes I showed you from interior, together with the color and the Martians, the plexi from the Martians. This is all the people that I had ever worked with, set in the Martian typeface in colors from Wiels, and it goes on. And this is the museum section, which showed things that inspire me, and they were in kind of traditional glass cases. And then we also made this gigantic wall of letters that I collect, just the alphabet, just to show the kind of things that inform the practice. And then the archive space was showed all the books, and also this. There was a small documentary made about my work, which was shown on the TV, so you could kind of find out more about it. So I have one more exhibition to show you, and that's the most recent one, which was at the V&A Museum in London. And so if I'm supposed to talk about deconstruction, this one is kind of deconstructing how, what kind of medium you use to tell a story. And it was the idea of the curators, Ligaya Salazar and Laurie Britton Newell, to make an exhibition that's a book. So they commissioned a new writer, Harry Kunzer, who is a British novelist, to write a story, and then commissioned illustrators to illustrate that story, but specifically for the exhibition. This is a slide an illustration that shows our working practice. We had a lot of sessions working together, trying to figure out how to show the story in the space. So the idea was that you would walk through the show and read the story. This is Harry at the bottom explaining the story to us, and then the curators explaining the illustrators. And the V&A were really worried about it because it's the first exhibition. I don't know if it's the first. It was an exhibition without any explanatory text, no labels, no nothing. It was only the text of the story. So we had to do things like this, which is real-size projections to audience group testing to see if people got it. And the story is about London set in the future, and the idea that people have taken over London who believe that we should go back to nature. So that these people are running London, and we are forbidden to use any kind of technology and any kind of memory device or anything, that everybody has to live back in nature. It's kind of telling you about the negative aspects about that. I'm not explaining it so well, but you get the idea. And so it's all about decay and about what's left of our contemporary way of transmitting messages. And so we thought it'd be good maybe to use the idea of decay and work with rusted metal lettering, like how sometimes you see signs that have fallen off or that are being destroyed, things like that. So we ended up typesetting the whole story, which was, I don't know, 20,000 words, I don't know, in metal, and then getting it rusted in the studio, and then applying those metal letters to the walls. And it was quite a complicated process because we had these letters laser cut so that they could be poked out, as you see. And then they arrived in sheets before they were poked out. Then we rusted them. We poked out all the letters, and then collected them all in these little bags that were all the texts, all the different texts, and then made molds, vinyl molds, apply them to the wall, and then put the letters back with a little bit of glue. And I was on maternity leave, so Mark Al-Khatib is a hero, and he did it all together with some assistants. I think it took 2 weeks full time to glue all the text. This was the title wall, so with some rusted lettering. These are the people that were in the exhibition. It was supposed to be a survey show of contemporary illustration and graphic design. And this is just to show you. It was quite tough to integrate the illustration and the text because the works were all new commissions, so we didn't know in advance what size they would be. So that was a tricky part. And we also did the invitation card, which we screen printed in metal and then rusted. And there, in the end, there is also a book, which is more showing the sketches because it was made before the exhibition, but you can read the story in it. I'll quickly show you a few books, and then we'll be done. Tree of Codes is a book that we made together with Jonathan Safran, who's an American novelist. And he had the idea to take this book by Bruno Schulz, written in 1934, called Street of Crocodiles. It's a really classical book that he always admired. And taking the text and removing words and writing a new story in that way without changing the order of the words. So this is a mock-up to show you how it could have been. And quite early on, Jonathan came up with the idea that maybe the words could be cut out. So instead of erasing them, there would be holes. So the whole process of design was how can you make that into a book? And this was a very early example of a test we did. But obviously it was way too flimsy because there's no way you're going to be able to bind the book like this. So what I'll show you is a process we went through with the printers trying to figure out how to make it possible to produce this book. So the second option we did was, okay, maybe we can try and make it a bit more solid by removing each word. And then the printer, we cut out one as well by hand to see what it would look like. But the printer immediately said, no, that would just take too long if we have to take out every little piece of paper. We have to make them so they can go out in one strip. So we did that and connected them together, but then the little corners were too fidgety so that they would have ripped as well. So then we made it into long strips, and that still the paper was not strong enough. It was too delicate, the bridges of paper. So the whole exercise was a balance between making the gaps big enough for the paper to be cut out and the bridges strong enough. So these are some more tests. And this is a sample of it going through the binding machine. And so this is the final ratio that we came up with. 2 millimeters, 20 millimeters for the gap and 10 for the bridges. And then we had to draw, every single page had a different drawing because it had to be drawn in Illustrator to be able to make the metal molds that cut out the holes. And we found a machine, I'll show you later, that punched out the pieces of paper at the same time. So that saved a lot of space. But then we thought, we don't have a 3D program, and it's impossible in InDesign to see what happens when you lay these pages on top of each other. So some really lovely students came and helped for an afternoon to cut out the whole book. And it was great we did it because there was one hole that went all the way through the book. And then we realized that we needed to add an extra layer of leading so that pages could shift. And we started to design in color layers so that also Jonathan could input in and give comments about maybe where text should be dense and where it should be less dense, things like that. So what I'll show you now is a quick movie of the book being produced, which is made by the Canvas, a Belgian TV station. So it had to be collated by hand because it couldn't go through the machine. Yeah, so the whole book is kind of a whole. And we didn't design the cover, so if you see it in the shop, it's by John Gray, who designs a lot of books for Jonathan. I might just quickly go through this one. We also designed the book for the Guggenheim, which is for the Hugo Boss Prize, where we worked with the folding of the paper. So each artist had like their own section. We made like a fold-out pieces of a flap, which looked like this. And this is something I think James Goggin already showed in his talk. It's a very old project that we've been doing together since 2005, and it's still ongoing for an art center in London. And every exhibition they do, we make one of these file notes, and you can collect them and buy a set of 10 in a binder, or you can buy one of them. And they always have a really nice text, but also an ISBN number and a reading list and a biography. This is another book we recently did for Wiels. It just came out. It's a really amazing German artist, Franz Erhard Walter, who makes these interactive fabric pieces. So the work is designed to be used by the viewers of the exhibition. And this is him explaining his work and some photographs. And for this one, the curator had the idea that maybe the book could work in a similar way. So he made a pop-up book that kind of duplicates some of his artworks. So that's it for books. So I just have a few more slides about occasional papers. As Emmett said, it's a publishing company that I started together with Anthony Hudek, who's my partner. And we started it kind of basically because we wanted to do something together. He's an art historian. And we both felt that in our respective disciplines, there wasn't enough being published about certain histories. And especially in graphic design, I always felt that there is an overload of coffee table books that give you the 100 best business cards, but don't give you any information about the process, or that don't give you any in-depth knowledge or whatever. And we also really felt it's important to make affordable books, because so many, especially design books, are just unaffordable to students. So those are like the remits. And the very first book was more like a pamphlet that we did in 2008, I think. And it's together with Fraser Muggeridge. Fraser went to this tiny exhibition that was on in South London. And he said to me, "Oh, nobody's gonna go see this exhibition, and it's amazing. It's Ken Briggs, who was a designer in the 60s of program brochures for the National Theatre in London. And he kind of imported the Swiss style into London. And Wim Crowell used to call him the colorist because he was so good at using color. And Fraser said, "Oh, nobody's going to see this exhibition." And so we came up with the idea of making a little booklet for him and doing it in time for the closing of the exhibition and doing a launch there to get all our friends to go and look at the work. So we managed to, in 2 weeks' time, go interview him, transcribe it, edit it, and design it and print it in time for the closing. So it was not much more than in fact, it had the same size as Ken's program brochures, which were designed to fit in ladies' handbags as they went to the theater. But I just want to show you, make you listen to a very short audio clip by Ken speaking, which is kind of explaining a little bit one of the reasons why we started Occasional Papers. I hope.
One of the students did say, "Why don't you give a talk about what we do?" And so I did. And tried to flit it through very quickly. And there was an outcry. He said, "For Christ's sake, let's look at the bloody thing before you switch off." So I had to go back again. And I just found it too embarrassing, really. And then there was another occasion when I had to talk my way through it. I found it just too much.
I guess what I was trying to say is that we are kind of maybe used to a few well-known designers, and they get invited to speak at things, and it's always the same people, and maybe we are missing a lot of people like Ken, who really got forgotten about because he wasn't very good at promoting himself or standing on a stage explaining what he does. So that's kind of one of the things we try and do with occasional papers. And even though it's a small pamphlet, it also includes a full biography of his work. And then the second book we did was also with Fraser Marguerite, and it was a one-day conference about book design. So there are all the papers from the talk. I'll only show you the books related to design because we've also done quite a lot of art books. This is one that Emmett mentioned with Richard Hollis. It's his collected writing. Richard Hollis, if you don't know him, is a really amazing English designer. He wrote a concise history of graphic design, which is a textbook that you should really buy if you haven't got it already, about history of graphic design. But he's also a fantastic designer and a real inspiration to a lot of English young designers. And all his life he's been writing about his contemporaries or people he admires, and so for a whole different styles of publications. So this is an article he did for ... but he also wrote for The Guardian. And I'll quickly show you another clip of the book launch. Doing book launches is usually also an important aspect of what we do, because we try and generate debate around our books. And this is an audio clip of Richard talking about working on a computer to Nicholas Sirota, who was his director at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, for who Richard designed a lot of things.
I think you gain typographic finesse is much, much easier. So you don't. The problem is that, of course, it's much faster, so that you're inclined to make decisions quickly. And it's interesting that I was working with an artist, this about a year ago, and you see, what's wonderful is sitting with somebody, doing it together, because mostly the artist or curator or whoever can make most of the decisions. You only got to say, is this more important than that? They say, oh, that. And so you just do it. And anyway, this painter said, you know, you don't think the type's a bit big, do you? So I said, maybe. And so he printed it out. And it seemed to me to be better. She said, you don't think it's still a bit big, do you? So I sort of looked at her. So I said, well, we can try it. And of course it was better, even smaller. So that the artist contributes. It's not. It's that is easy about the computer. But I think the relationship between the client and the designer has changed completely, because the clients, curators, everyone knows that you can change things, and they think they can do it. They know it's easy to change things. And so the designer is in the grip, is bullied by these people in the most appalling way, and young people particularly. This is why I think it's important to have this kind of background of knowing how communication works, how it's worked in the past. That is the value of history, to give you knowledge, because you have to know about visual communication, which you're far more than your client, your curator, your artist. You have to know more, and they have to listen to you. It's no good they're saying...
Yeah, you get what I mean. This I already talked about, and this was our most recent book, which is a book about Dom Sylvester Huidar, who was a most amazing concrete poet, but also a monk who got kind of forgotten as well. So we commissioned new writing about him, and the book also includes a lot of images of his work. And this is the last one, which is one that we are launching tomorrow, and it's a reprint of a book by Robert Filliou, which is an amazing French artist who made this book in 1973, and it's been out of print since. And it's supposed to be a teaching tool, and also an interactive book where the reader can fill in their comments in the middle. And the final slide is the forthcoming book that we are working on together with MoMA about a collection of artist ephemera and from invites from exhibitions from their library. So that'll come out hopefully in April. Thank you. Do I have to ask if are there any questions? No? Okay, let's go home. Yeah.
There was the Wiels building, but then there was other building where you didn't really want to create a specific logo per se, and you had several artists, make logos. I know that they had their names on there too. Were they lucky and got paid too, or just curious?
Yes, they got paid and credited. Yeah, it's supposed to be an ongoing thing, but yeah.
This is a pragmatic question. You mentioned the furniture book, but with all the recycled materials. I wondered if you could say that slowly or spell it so we could make a note of it.
Maybe if I wait a minute. You're welcome.
Hi. You've worked with a lot of galleries, so the Barbican, the V&A, the Tate, I believe, as well. Is that a conscious choice, and what do you feel are particular challenges of working with institutions which themselves have an interest in visual culture and the arts versus, say, a business or somebody else who's sort of a non-expert?
It's not a choice. I started working for friends who were artists, and then they recommended me, and then somehow you get labeled a cultural designer, but it's not like I, from the beginning, said I'm just gonna do that. But somehow, I don't know, we don't get asked to do other things. So maybe I should just try and go out there and get, because better paid work, which would be nice also. But I think maybe the challenge is that you do have to be respectful because it's an artist's work and you want to present them in as good as possible. And you're not always, I don't know, I kind of dream of maybe doing a job where you can come up with your own imagery or even commission an illustrator or do a photo shoot or something like that, where you're maybe more of the creative. And I often feel if you represent someone's artwork, you should do it as good as possible for them, not putting your voice on top. So I guess that's a challenge. It's becoming quite difficult in the UK because a lot of museums have now started having really strong marketing departments, and especially since the economic downturn, they are a lot more worried to experiment as well. So I don't know if it really gives you that much more freedom. I can't compare, but I don't know if it's really true that, especially in the UK, if it's so much better. There was a question here, I think. Yeah. Yeah. The concrete poet. Let me type it for you. Dom Sylvester Huedar. Yeah.
I've got a question from Twitter, and I actually feel kind of compelled to read it because people are starting to gang up. Daniel Sequira is asking, he's representing the AIGA St. Louis viewing party, and they're wondering how expensive it must have been to produce the book with all the die cuts. And then after that, the AIGA Iowa viewing party chimes in that they would also like to know. So you've got multiple states wondering how much that thing cost.
I think the printing was 20,000 euros. Yeah. That for 3,000 copies. But I'm not entirely sure. I should ask the publisher, but I can't. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't quite remember. Yeah. They will be upset if I quote it wrong. Yeah. So maybe can you delete it? They're called visual editions. I forgot to say that. That's the publisher. What's that?
How did the architecture of the die-cut book, like dealing with whether or not the page would be strong enough, affect what words got picked? Did it make it harder to make like nice sentences or the story?
That was done before. So we received the text. The story was written just in Word. So Jonathan took the existing text and removed, just did strike through on the words he didn't want. But then we kind of cheated, because if we would have typeset the actual book at the leading you saw, it would have been a book like this. So we took out a lot more words than actually were removed, if you see what I mean. Yeah, the order is the same as what he wrote, but the gaps are smaller than what they would have been. And that way it also allowed us to control a little bit the see-through of what you see on the next page. Yeah, but it's quite hard to read. The text on its own is hard to read. It's quite abstract, but then, yeah, the book itself, because you constantly see other text, makes it harder. But I think that's kind of part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I just have a question regarding the logo and brand identity. Have you ever experienced a time when you're working with an existing logo for a client and kind of had to explain your idea and convince them? I was wondering if there were ever any, if you could give any examples, or like maybe what the toughest example of that, or if there was any time that you'd experienced a time when you had to explain and kind of fight for your idea.
You mean when having to use a logo and not wanting to do that? Or?
Like if there's already an existing identity or logo and they're kind of looking for a new one, or if you came up with anything newer and if you had to just kind of explain it. I don't know if that...
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of with everything. I think, for example, with Wiels, I can show you, I think it's even in the brochure, maybe in the spread I showed, the amount of versions we did. Don't know if it's in there. Yeah. On the top right, there's like a design of a poster. We had all these different stages. So the logo was an idea from the beginning, but in the very beginning it was a much more condensed and much more angular logo. And then they wanted it to look more friendly, so we made it a bit more friendly. And in the beginning we tried to suggest using artists in the building, because the building was derelict for such a long time. And they didn't like the idea of promoting the artist as a celebrity. So then it became that we just replace it by a poster. So I think it's a constant kind of battle like that. But what I think what's maybe good to realize is often when someone says something like, we're having someone at the moment saying, I don't like yellow, And they sometimes say that not because they don't like yellow, but because there's something about the design that's not quite working, and maybe rather than just changing the color, it's trying to think what it is and then presenting another option. And that very often pushes things in the right direction rather than, because actually we have one client at the moment who's just happy with everything, and it makes me quite insecure also, because it can't be right from the start, I think. I don't know. It depends if you are in the same wavelength, but usually it gets better when you have more steps to the process. Depends on the kind of comment you get, I guess.
Thank you.
In a lot of your work, you seem to set parameters for sort of how you want it to be designed. And I was sort of kind of in relation to the last question. Do you tend to share those parameters with your client, or is it something that you sort of keep to yourself as part of the process?
Usually they're part of the what's shared with the client. It's like how to explain it. I always find it easier to convince someone when you can give them reasons why, rather than just saying I like pink. It's like this is the idea behind the pink, and then they get it, kind of. Especially with like the nature exhibition, it would have been impossible not to share why we were doing those kinds of things. But I think some of this is also post-rationalizing a little bit. It's trying to think of examples. I don't know. Yeah, I think it definitely. I definitely try and present ideas rather than finished products in a way, and then that makes them part of the process, and it's a conversation about that and not about taste, and that's much easier to have, I think. Like we were working on an identity at the moment, and it's supposed to be about doodles. So then they can talk about what doodles they like, or not about the fact that they're in yellow and that the typeface is Times or whatever. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering how you stage a pitch. What do you like to do? Do you like to use slides? Do you tell stories, or how do you? Or is each project different in how you will go about convincing the client?
It's usually just a slideshow like this, and then quite often it has options. It'll almost always show also the research, not like things we've been looking at. Yeah, we don't really do a lot of staging, or usually it's quite last minute and not well paid, so we try not to make it too much. Yeah. Yeah, often it's more like, okay, this is how we would approach it, and these are some references, or these are things. Also, maybe just to show that you've read the brief, that you know what they're looking at, kind of thing. Yeah.
I was wondering, do you know how to speak the Martian language that you created, or is it just purely visual?
It's actually English. It's like Dingbat English. We should have invented the actual. Yeah, but that would have just been crazy. Yeah. Maybe you could try to read it.
When you're first starting out with your projects and you're in the initial concepting phase, do you have a place that you like to start in your research or brainstorming as you approach the system for a client project?
I guess kind of Google is like, or even. But I also like just walking on the street and just thinking, but also just as much and equally important is other people in the studio thinking about it and talking about it. That's usually how it starts, or just turning off your computer and writing down some ideas. And then what's really nice is when one person comes up an idea, to see someone else visualize it, to like share ideas and see what happens when someone else interprets it. Or I really like that. I don't really have a set way of now I'm going to think of an idea. I guess going through some books. I find it looking on design blogs always gets me a bit, freezes me a bit. It doesn't really help. Usually then you start to stress out a bit too much, because it's more intimidating or something. It's maybe not such a good point to get inspired by. I like looking at old books or things that are not directly related to what contemporaries are doing. Or talking to my partner who knows about art. He's usually quite good in coming up with ideas.
As a typophile and person who loves type, do you have any favorite fonts or go-to typographers that you find yourself going back to repeatedly?
I like grotesque, empty grotesque a lot. The one that's used in the slide. That one. But apart from that, no, not really. I quite like classical fonts that are kind of out there, that don't feel too fussy, or I don't know, that maybe we are a bit more used to, I guess, for certain things. But then, yeah, I try not to have things like that, actually. Not to have, I'm doing things this way. I try to really push myself not to have systems like that of doing things. And that's what's nice about collaborating, or that's what I was trying to explain with the identities as well, to always try and do things in a different way, or yeah. Like using Arial when you're not supposed to, I guess, yeah.
Do you have any advice for students on kind of the transition from education into being, kind of starting out professional, and or any thoughts on kind of your own evolution and what that was like for you?
Yeah, I think I would recommend trying to, if you want to go work for yourself, to first work for a few different studios that are quite different from each other, to learn how they work, because I didn't really do that, and it's been quite painful having to learn how a bigger studio works, not even big, but just a studio with one person, more than one person, and how you manage projects with a team, how you structure stupid things like files on the server or things like that, practical things. I was really lucky in the sense that after I finished at Jan van Eyck in Holland, a friend of mine, I didn't really feel like going back to Belgium, and a friend of mine said at Foundation 33 they were looking for someone and that my work was really similar. So I sent them an email, and after a bit back and forth I went over to London for an interview, and there were really strong similarities between a few projects. So I thought, why not, I'll go to London for a year, and got the job. And then when I was there, I was at an opening, a design opening, and met James Goggin, and I was complaining that I had to work for a boss. Even though it was Daniel Eatock, he was a really great boss, I still didn't like the fact that I wasn't having direct contact with the client. And James said, I need to move into a new studio space. Why don't you come and share a studio with me? I have a bit too much work, but I don't want to hire someone. I'll give you some work. And it was for his benefit that he didn't have to have the responsibility, but then for me, I had a little bit of security of some work coming in. So it was just lucky, I think. And then he recommended me to some people. So don't know if that's advice. I think just working for things you really like, and like for your friends, and I think that kind of will show, and that hopefully you'll get recommended like that. I think that's just how it happened with me. I'm trying to be true to who you are and not follow too many trends or feel like you do what you have to do or that kind of thing maybe, and not listen to your tutors too much. Like I did quite well in school in Brussels every year, and then I went on an exchange program to Spain just for 2 months, but it made me really see things differently about what I was missing. And then when I returned, I did really badly in school, but it was because I started asking questions, and that then allowed me to get into the Jan van Eyck Academie. So I could have just kept on doing what I was being trained to do in a way, which wasn't a bad thing, but sometimes it's good to not just think what you're being taught is it or is final, or which I'm sure you're not. But, yeah.
All right, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.